Natalie asks on here, what is the fivefold ministry and is it biblical?
I can tell you right off the bat that the fivefold ministry is not biblical because it's only fourfold. What she's talking about is in Ephesians chapter 4, and in that passage, Jesus talks, or Paul talks about the gifts that God gave to the church to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, and it's in verse 11. And it says he gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers. And the last phrasing there, some pastors and teachers, it's not pastors and teachers, it's pastor teachers. And so it's making that one exactly the same. It's not two different ministries there. And so it's only fourfold in the first place in the Greek, and so there, the fivefold ministry thing is a misnomer in the first place. As far as the fivefold ministry goes, yes, it's scriptural this passage, obviously it's in the Bible. And so, yeah, it's scriptural. What's not scriptural about it is when people try to make it something where these things have to be taking place in the church, and in the sense of every church needs to have necessarily these ministries going on. And let me qualify that here for a second. Most churches that are talking about the fivefold ministry in this passage, the major problem that they have with this passage is around the term apostle. And apostles are something that is biblical, but you have two kinds. And so you have the apostles that Jesus picked. And so those were the 12, ends up being the 11. And then in Acts chapter 1, they draw lots and they increase that number back to 12. We know that Paul was also an apostle in that sense, as far as being somebody who was a witness of the resurrection of Christ. And so when I think of apostles, I think of two groups of people. You have apostles like Paul, who witnessed Jesus' resurrection, and Peter and James and John and all of those guys. They were all witnesses of the resurrection. And then you have other apostles who are guys who start churches. And so you have Barnabas and Silas and different guys like that who are also called apostles in the Bible. But these guys are not guys who write scripture. These guys are guys that start churches. The guys who wrote scripture were guys who were witnesses again to the resurrection, or they were close associates of somebody who was a witness to the resurrection. And the reason that I'm pointing that out, and actually you can find this in Acts chapter 1, when Peter is looking for the qualifications of the apostle that's going to replace Judas Iscariot. He talks about the fact that we need to have somebody who was a witness of the ministry of Jesus from the time of John until Jesus' death, basically, and is a witness of the resurrection. And so that was Peter's standard for what an apostle was. And the reason that that's important is because all the books of the New Testament are written by a guy who's a witness of the resurrection or a close associate of a guy who's a witness of the resurrection. So, for example, Mark is not one of the 12, but he is a guy who was tied in with Peter, who was one of the 12. And according to church history, Mark's gospel is nothing but Peter's sermons. Luke is tied in with Paul the Apostle, and then you have James and Jude, who are brothers of Jesus, and they are both witnesses of the resurrection of Christ and became followers of Christ early on. And so all the books of the New Testament are written by guys who were witnesses of the events of the ministry of Christ and the resurrection in the first century. And so there are no apostles in that sense anymore. They don't exist. And so there are guys who are going around talking about the fivefold ministry and claiming to be apostles in the same sense that the apostles at the very beginning were. And that's just nonsense. They can't be. They don't qualify. The other thing that you have is also in the book of Ephesians. Earlier on in the book, Paul talks about our foundation, and when he talks about what the church is built on, he says this: "Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone." And the apostles and prophets that are being spoken about there are apostles and prophets in the Bible. And so we're built on the foundation of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Zechariah and all of these guys. Those are the prophets that we're built on. Jesus himself is a prophet. And so you have that. The apostles that are being spoken about are the apostles that Jesus chose. They're the apostles that are going to have their name on the foundations of the New Jerusalem, for example. Those apostles are the foundation of the church, and those are our apostles. And so when somebody, for example, who's in the Mormon church asks me, do you have apostles in your church? And I say, yes. And they go, well, who are they? And I go, Peter, James, John, Bartholomew, and go down the list. Nathaniel and so on, Jude and so on. Those are the foundation of the church. And so we have the New Testament being the foundational work, which was written by these kinds of guys. They were the witnesses of the ministry of Christ, and they are the foundation of the church. The church got started being built 2,000 years ago, and you don't build for a generation and then lay another foundation, and then build for a generation and then lay another foundation. There's only one foundation, and again, it's the apostles and the prophets. Again, Jesus Christ being the chief cornerstone. And he says, in whom the whole building being fitted together grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. So when God talks about this ministry of the apostles, they laid the foundation 2,000 years ago, and we're all living stones that are being built on this building. And Jesus is the cornerstone in the foundation. He's also going to be the capstone at the top. And so he's at the beginning, he's at the end, he's the Alpha, he's the Omega, and so on and so forth. But there is only one foundation, and that's a foundation that's been laid by those guys. So in the sense of the real problem that I have with the fivefold ministry, as most places or most guys are talking about it, is they take an office on themselves that they can't fulfill. They do not write Scripture. They do not have the authority to write Scripture. They do not have the same kind of authority as the 12 did or do, and that whole thing is nonsense, and it's nothing but manipulation in that sense. When I look at some of the other things that go along with that, apostles and prophets, do we have apostles nowadays? Yeah, nowadays we have them. Apostles were people who started churches, and so missionaries are apostles. They go out and they start churches. They preach the gospel, and signs and wonders following. I've been on missionary trips and seen God do just really cool things, and so those things are continuing today. But they're not apostles like the 12. So anybody who ever tells you that doesn't know what he's talking about, and most likely you need to watch your wallet, because he's coming after you. And so be careful about that. Some prophets, some evangelists. Obviously, we have evangelists. Prophets are guys who speak the heart of God to a generation, and I think that we have prophets. When I look at people down through the years, Alan Redpath is a guy that I think spoke prophetically. Billy Graham is an evangelist, but I think that he spoke prophetically also. A.W. Tozer is a guy who spoke prophetically for his generation. As far as who are the guys that are prophets nowadays, most of the guys who are spouting off the most about being prophets, I wouldn't consider a prophet at all. It's like they're I don't know, they're weak sauce. And so I don't consider these guys that. A prophet, again, is somebody who just speaks forth the heart of God. And There's some cool guys who are like that. Evangelists, obviously, people who have a ministry of evangelism, and then pastor teachers, and I'm one of those. I'm both a pastor in the sense of a shepherd. That's what the word pastor means, and a teacher. Pastors, shepherds, and teachers. That ministry goes together, and so in that sense, it's absolutely true. And what we're here for is for the equipping of the saints, for the work of ministry. And so I evangelize, I pastor, I teach, I have prophesied, and I've even started churches. And so those things are obviously continuing on to this day. So, is that good?
Okay. Yeah.